There have been a lot of thank yous already, but I have to do this because none of us would be here, my community would not be here, if I didn't go through this very important list. So first of all, it's to Boon Hui. Please stand up and let us give you a round of applause. So Boon Hui, I know you're new to the city, but there are people in this audience who used to sit in this very auditorium 20, 25 years ago when Asia Society would do programs like the Buddha of Suburbia. And it was a place where this discourse around diaspora began for us as a community, because this was one of the few places that allowed us access to the works of artists like Hanif Qureshi. So it's wonderful to be here today. Thank you for opening your doors in a way that has not been open to us in this institution before. It couldn't have happened without your presence. Also, big shout out to Bharti Lalwani for introducing us. I'd like to, of course, thank everyone at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, Lisa in particular, for coming through and keeping this project intact as you inherited it. And most of all to Lawrence. Once again, if you could stand and we could give you a round of applause. And next, we have Prerna Reddy. Prerna! Prerna is the Director of Public Events and Community Engagement at the Queen's Museum. And I was very lucky to hire her in 2003 and bring her onto the museum. And when I told Tom Finkelpearl about her, I told him she will outlast me, but she outlasted Tom Finkelpearl. So there's to Prerna and the commitment she brings to institutions. When Lawrence opened the door at the Smithsonian for the convening and for the exhibition, and Boon Hui said, yes, we'll do this, there were two people I knew I could call to fill the gaps and to make the show happen in the ambitious, beautiful way that it deserves. And those two people are Max and Monique Berger. So please also stand up, because without you, none of us would be able to share our work with everyone. And I'm going to get personal for 1 minute. When I was 40, I had a very difficult pregnancy and a child after great trauma. And when I sent Monique the email to say that Zenith was here and he'd arrived into this world, she sent me the most beautiful email. And it was an email not just to me, but it was an email to every woman and to every artist. So I'm going to share this email with you and what she said to me, because I want you to do what she says with me. So she said, Monique said to me, the goals we set ourselves may sometimes seem like unattainable fantasies, but there is a way to make them real. The key to attaining them is to bring them sharply into focus, to see them as realities with clear contours and a path that leads to them. If it lies within our nature to dream, then it is also within us to make our dreams come true. Taking risks keeps us in motion, enriching our lives no matter what the outcome. So thank you for that, and thank you for supporting all the risks that I take, Monique. And so with that, I'm coming to you and saying that as a community, the point of this exhibition and this convening is to dream together. We don't have structures, we don't have curators, we don't have organizations. And those of us who have been successful in spite of all of the circumstances, not because we have these support structures behind us. When I stand here, I see around me a room full of incredibly talented people, people who have MacArthur Genius Awards, who have Guggenheim Fellowships, who've shown in the most prestigious biennials in the world. And I think that we deserve for our community's work to be looked together. And I'm hoping that this exhibition and this convening is not just an intervention. I'm hoping that this is our opportunity to come together and build structures to think about what our needs are, to identify those needs, and maybe with all of our collective brain power and our resources, we can come up with some solutions to bring more visibility to this community. Because we are going to talk a lot about our invisibility. We're going to talk a lot about the structures that we don't have. But I want to take a moment and acknowledge all the power and the resources that are in this room today. And I want us to think about the fact that if we come together, the power that we have is going to go beyond our individual practices, beyond our individual institutions, and it can impact us on a much larger national scale. So I implore every one of you who's here today to spend the next 3 days talking to as many artists, curators, academics as you can. Spend as much time as you can listening to us as we talk about our work and the challenges that we face. And I hope you stay with us beyond these 3 days. I hope you use this opportunity to get to know our work and to open more and more and more doors for us, because we don't have enough visibility yet. Thank you so much. My apologies. I would like to introduce everyone who's going to be on the opening night panel, starting with the moderator, Anuradha Vikram. Anuradha, please join us on stage. We also have Swati Khurana, Allan deSouza, Asha Ganpat, Jaret Vadera, and Naeem Mohaiemen. And I just briefly want to say that this panel of incredibly smart artists has been brought here because every one of them plays a role that goes beyond the role of artist. And they are contributing as cultural producers to our cultural landscape, not just as artists. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jaishri. It's an honor to be invited to kick off this convening. I want to say my big thanks to Jaishri Abichandani, to the Asia Society, to the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, and to the Queen's Museum for inviting us this weekend. But most importantly, I need to say thank you to these incredible artists whose work is on view in Lucid Dreams and Distant Visions. Double duty, agency and cultural production. The title of this panel goes to the heart of why we're here this weekend. Who has the agency over the uses to which our artistic and cultural production is put? Double duty speaks to the load that many of us carry as hyphenated Americans and hyphenated practitioners, artist, curator, critic, scholar, administrator, art historian. Our very existence is an object lesson in intersectional practice and discourse. Double duty also references the double or the dual consciousness of Du Bois and Fanon. Fanon says, consciousness of the body is a solely negating activity. It is a third-person consciousness. The body is surrounded by an atmosphere of certain uncertainty. Fanon's uncertainty is contrasted by the cosmopolitanism of his inheritors, which is a condition that merits exploration by the international urban community of South Asian artists. Individual artists from within our community have been able to mine cultural histories, memories, and narratives, and yet transcend the national and ethnic categorizations to achieve representation within mainstream cultural institutions. Many of these artists are here with us today. How has this been achieved? With whose sanction? And to what ends? How can we use this convening to help one another negotiate these questions ethically and also sustainably? In a letter from an arts worker published this week on Arts Black, African-American arts administrator Delana Dameron wrote, "I feel that enough of us do not have such places, providing life-giving oxygen. And we are searching desperately for an airlock, a place with people who want us to live, to survive at all. The airlock," she describes, is a place where her complex selves can be reconciled, a place where the people both look like her and think like her, a place that's in short supply. This weekend is our airlock. How do we ensure it is a generative and responsive one? How will we proliferate spaces where we can collectively thrive? The first speaker this evening will be the artist Naeem Mohaiemen. His work is currently on view in both editions of the Documenta in Athens and in Kassel. He's also one of the co-founders of the Visible Collective, and he's going to tell us some stories from that time. This was represented in the 2005 show Fatal Love, which was the revisiting of which is the impetus for our gathering today. So please join me in welcoming Naeem to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Anuradha. Good evening, everyone. I'm really here representing a collective that formed at the 2005 Fatal Love show in Queen's Museum, which is the occasion for the convening this weekend, and the focus of a lot of conversations we've been having over the last couple of years about what it means to start new things through an exhibition. You will hear the words community, you will hear the word support quite often this weekend, and I want to think about ways that community can be formed through the process of exhibition making, and also ways that it can get weaker over time as some forms of achievement that people talk about often as desirable can also work against that community. I'm thinking especially of hyper-individuation that exhibition making in the United States and everywhere also does, which often works against community. So the group, which is called Visible Collective, at least two or three of members are here today and speaking over the weekend, was formed actually at the exhibition. And the story is that myself and Ibrahim Qureshi were invited among the 22 artists showing in this exhibition. And over time, as we started building the project, we added in many people. And at a certain point, it became such that you couldn't now add 12 new people's names on the wall of the show. And so then we formed this collective, which originally was going to be absolutely temporary just for this exhibition, and then kept going for a lot of years until we also decided we didn't want to work in that collective form anymore. I was looking this week for images from that show, and 2005 being the cusp of certain kinds of digital production, it's a little hard to get images. It's still right before mobile phones and etc. So I found a few images, and I was looking at the exhibition faces, trying to see who I could recognize, if anybody. And I found this photograph. It's quite pixelated, but actually you can see Prema Murthy against the corridor, and Esmitra Kalita in the front, and then a lot of other people whose faces I cannot make out. Our project for the Queen's Museum for that project was called Disappeared in America, and it was specifically about post 9/11 security panic and the hyper-othering of citizens or immigrants presumed to be Muslim. And one of the ways that we did the double duty that Anuradha has talked about is that we were makers, but we always constantly had to explain the work and also build the discourse around it. Because there were not really reviews being written, there were not really a ecology of conversation between us, for example, with social media. So we would always also have to have the conversations we wished would happen anyway. And one of the elements we used was this. We would show this every time we did a talk at the Queen's Museum about the members of the Visible Collective. And at the very beginning, there were many members. Over time, it changed also. But basically, the top chart, dark green, were people who are citizens by birth, i.e. they were born in the US. The middle tier, the light green, are people who were born elsewhere, but by 2005 had become US citizens, so they were naturalized. And the third group, in which I'm also there, were the people who had green cards at the time. And one of the reasons we would show this chart is to say to audiences who might look at representations of racial profiling of immigrants and citizens after 2001 and think, well, the community is speaking. It was really important to emphasize that we weren't the community either. We actually called this the citizenship privilege matrix, because all of us had some level of safety that would allow us to speak, and the vast vulnerable population couldn't speak, and today also still can't speak. And we see that even in the media today as to who can speak bravely and who cannot. So by now, actually, I think everyone at the bottom of the list has also become a citizen 12 years later. And then I wanted to show this chart, for which I am actually going to go to the web, so you don't have to strain your eyes. This is something actually that was prior to this conference I was talking about with friends, and then the conference became the sort of excuse or deadline to start it. It's online. I'm going to put the URL on the Facebook group after this conference so people can edit it. So it's very temporary. But basically, just to explain, on the left side are various kinds of political organizations that would also do a little bit of arts work. On the right side are either arts organizations or exhibitions. And the size of the bubble is basically proportional to how many links there are. So that's the Fatal Love show of 2005. And this is the Lucid Dreams show of 2017. And you can actually see who's in both shows. And then there are these other shows, Out of India, 1997, Lines of Control in 2005, which introduces another concept we should talk about, which is people who live here but then also move back to whichever country they were from. Are they still diaspora or not, is a conversation. Shifting Shapes in 2009, Sultana's Dream. The reason that Jaishri has 2 lines in a curve is because she was both the curator and in the show, which is also something to talk about in terms of double duty. Double Bind in 2014, Loving Blackness, which was this year, and Lucid Dreams, as I mentioned. And then there are, for lack of a better word, the mainstream exhibitions. I've just picked 2 as an example. The Whitney Biennial, you'll be astounded by how few South Asians have ever been in the Biennial, and Greater New York, an equally astounding number. Okay, then there are individuals within their original conglomeration, this is where the community question comes in, from whom there are no more lines after this. That's partially the weakness of my research. I haven't been able to find out what they're doing. In some cases, I was talking today to Chitra Ganesh Prerna Reddy, and discussing this, and one of the frequent answers I would hear about somebody is, oh, they moved to London, or they moved to XYZ place outside of New York. So it also illustrates that once people leave New York, they leave certain discussions. Then at the bottom are people who are maybe connected to Lucid Dreams or otherwise prominent in the New York community, but not necessarily yet linked up to many South Asian networks. It's Prem Krishnamurthy, who ran a space called Project, which has just closed. Okay, so then on the left-hand side are the political organizations that also were engaged in arts work, and back when there were no words like curating to describe it. Samar Magazine, YSS, which ran for many years. Mutiny of Vivek Bald is going to speak this weekend. Basement Bhangra. SASI, which now is essentially inactive. Taxi Workers Alliance, which is still going strong, very important organization, and is actually mounting the legal challenges to Uber. Campaign to Stop Funding Hate, Alwan, Progressive Pakistan Caucus, etc. So while I was putting together this chart, talking to friends about it and thinking what's missing, I actually started getting quite, I would hesitate to say depressed, but I started getting quite melancholic, because one of the things I started realizing is many of the organizations, especially the ones on the left, but also perhaps the ones on the right, are either now obsolete or not obsolete, but essentially obsolete, but no one wants to say they're over. And there can be many reasons for this. For example, Vivek Bald has talked about the fact that as people have gotten older, one of the things they've done is, of course, left this incredibly unsustainable city, a very difficult place for anyone to live, certainly cultural workers. Another thing is that as the community has gotten older, a younger generation hasn't necessarily taken over exactly the same formations. They might be working on something very different, which may or may not be recognizable as South Asian community as we define it here, but maybe is even eluding our eyes because we don't define it that way. And then there's, of course, the relentless policing since 2001 that has also resulted in a dramatic change in this population, including a lot of the people from 2001 to 2005 aren't with us today or unable to be politically active for all sorts of reasons. The other aspect that I thought of, which is relevant to maybe the making of work and what we do, is that one of the things you'll hear often is access and visibility and success and achievement, and sustainability also, because with the achievement comes perhaps financial sustainability. But one of the things I want to just briefly talk about is the trend of hyper-individualization that is always linked to success in the art world. And in this context, I just want to read a very brief paragraph from this journal that came out from AALR, Local Express, in which a lot of us were talking. And here we talked about what happens when that achievement comes. You can also sense a palpable desire in this moment to highlight white-collar South Asian success, sidelining the working class population that was the bulk of post-80s migration. Vijay Prashad warned about exactly these tendencies when he responded to Du Bois' question, how does it feel to be a problem, by asking South Asian Americans, how does it feel to be a solution? Prashad argued in Karma of Bound Folk that Asian Americans allowed themselves to be pitted against African Americans as the exceptional minority, the one that purportedly disproved racism simply by working hard. Of course, the position of South Asians in America has gone through realignments and reversals as a hyper-profile population. But triumphalist celebrations of South Asian identity can still unmoor us from a longer span of shared histories. I wonder if the greater mainstream visibility of today could end up diluting a progressive pan-racial political moment. As we have seen in the past, the equations of mainstream acceptance always subtly demand that we leave something or someone behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Naeem. Our next speaker will be Swati Khurana. Swati Khurana is an artist and writer, and she's also a founding member of the South Asian Women's Creative Collective, also known as SAUCY, which Jaishri Abichandani was also a co-founder of. So please welcome Swati.
Okay. Here are some notes on how to be an artist or not to be an artist. Number 1, be an outsider. Wear your hair short and be mistaken for a boy. Have your grandmother send trick cereal UPC codes for a free t-shirt. Wear this free t-shirt often, including to a firehouse in Fort Lee, New Jersey, where your mom brings you for an egg decorating contest. Don't know what Easter is, who the Easter Bunny is, or that you should use the pastel pom-poms. Instead, make a red tulip and outline it in gold. Make the egg an essentialized Indian aesthetic, your mother's saris and your future wedding saris. Somehow win this contest. Resolve to later blend in more. Resolve to wear pastels. Resolve to be more American, even if they don't let you. Number 2, find your people, finally. Leave northern New Jersey for the Hudson Valley and move to New York City at the age of 17 and continue to live here for at least 23 years so far. Find the South Asians who are not performing acts of suitability for some archaic notions of community and make community with feminists, queer folks, writers, musicians, artists, dancers. Abandon Indian for South Asian, meet Jaishri Abichandani and Rekha Malhotra at age 19, go to salons, salga parties, basement Bhangra mutiny, make documentaries, screen indie films, help organize Asian American Heritage Month at Columbia so you can create panels, screenings, and talks and learn about the value of honorariums, compensating artists for their labor, leveraging institutional resources, and reclaiming office supplies for community use. Be part of something greater than yourself. When Jaishri Abichandani invites you to a SAUCY meeting, say yes. Join the South Asian Progressive Task Force at the India Day Parade to march to protest Salga's exclusion. Join the organizing committee for SAUCY and help develop this mission statement. SAUCY is a nonprofit arts organization dedicated to the advancement, visibility, and development of South Asian women artists and creative professionals. Go to Chitra Ganesh's rooftop in Prospect Heights and watch a Kathak dance show in the sunset. Even with that pulsating late 90s energy, create community virtually later. Yahoo groups, listservs, Facebook, private Facebook groups, email chains, WhatsApp messages. Look at each other, make work, share it privately to one another, and then in monthly meetings, and then at public events. Create new aesthetics, art histories, critical theories. Infiltrate cultural and academic institutions, continue reclaiming office supplies, consider graduate school not for law, medicine, or business, but art. Find others who do so. Organize road trips to Toronto for Desh Pradesh. Find your material. Understand that public and private means something different for us after 9/11. Experiment, play, look inward, deconstruct your wedding photographs at the cusp of your divorce. Make lawn drawings of yourself. Understand the shape of your face, the roundness, the arch of your eyebrows, the angles of your nose. Make really strange personal work. Show it slowly, secretly, until it is asked to be curated into the Fatal Love exhibition. Continue playing, experimenting, make some bad work, some good work. Keep making, applying to shows, residencies. Get lots of Thank you for applying, but no. And some yeses. Eventually rent a studio. Wonder when you will feel like you can call yourself a real artist, if the way you pay your bills is by teaching. Thinking everyone else is somehow real. Showing your work in group shows, a few solo shows, but still wondering when they will figure it out. How are you really here? 4, create a manifesto. Look outward, explode definitions, make trophies about every insult you have heard or told yourself. Least suitable girl, most reluctant housekeeper, least dutiful wife, most apprehensive fiance, most mannish granddaughter. Show the trophies. See how many women connect to the trophies. Collaborate with photographer Anjali Bhargava to summon a tribe, written about in an exhibition essay by Jaishri called A Tribe of Muses for the Saucy's 10th annual show in 2007. Collaborate with Anjali Bhargava and the subjects who nominated themselves, Prerna Reddy, Sadia Rahman, Meenakshi Thirukude. Award transgression, accept failures to live up to heteronormativity, create a conversation away from others, recognize your place, your body, your skin, your gender, understand that you're under surveillance, policed, even seen as a threat from every country that you have lived, and yet seek new optics, new ways of looking, to actually see yourself, to see each other, to see the work in deeper conversation, in shows with focus on women, South Asians, Asian Americans, people of color, and be really okay with it because for you, it was always about the conversation anyway. Leave the art market. Enter the gift economy. Make objects that are priceless. Either they are ephemeral or too precious to be collected. Become obsessed with your past love letters, make weird, emotionally inappropriate artwork with the physical letters, the deepest private moments tied with thread in a gold birdcage. Decide in 2011 to give up your studio, collect strangers' and friends' text messages, transcribe them to scrolls, give them away, photograph them, photograph the text in wall installations, reproduce them in LED screens and vinyl text, enjoy making the private public, become a keeper of secrets, share intimacies, give gifts, collect stories, realize that you always hated writing artist statements, but you actually like writing. 7, choose words. Get a residency, finally, after 4 rejections, to the Center for Book Arts. Immediately make protest posters for Saucy's Freedom Safety Now protest at the Indian consulate after the publicized horrific rape on a Delhi bus where the victim died in the same neighborhood that you were born, Safdarjung, New Delhi. Realize at the residency that for years you've been bringing books to your studio and have been reading fiction, and you decided that words, stories, and the slippery connection between memory and imagination, voices and peculiarities have always fascinated you, and begin something more painstaking than the embroideries you've made with your grandmothers, even less lucrative than art, a novel about people, some of whom create things we'd call art or create things we call life, because decades of art making, whether you engage with the market or not, had given you patience, trained your muscles for the act of observation, and to handle rejection. The tribe still matters. The muses are curated in your life. If you still continue to rage, reflect, dance, love, and create, and if a handful of your people are the ones who see you and read you, it would have still been worth it. Thank you.
Thank you, Swati. Our next speaker will be Allan deSouza. Allan is a California-based multimedia artist working in photography, installation, text, and performance, and he is also the chair of the Department of Art Practice at the University of California, Berkeley. Please welcome Allan.
Okay. Oh dear, that's a tough act to follow. I don't have any jokes. Okay. I've been asked to actually speak about my trajectory of becoming, I guess, South Asian, if we can put it that way. I was going to say actually becoming an artist, but actually no, in this context, it's how I became South Asian. So I started out, and in your brochures you'll see that I'm born in Kenya, which doesn't really tell you that much. but in Kenya, I was gone. And then my family moved to England, and I became an East African Asian. And then sort of grew up really as part of the first generation to have come from the colonies and then growing up in England, or perhaps people of my age also might have been born in England, but their parents had come from the former colonies. And we were the first generation to then enter art school from those particular trajectories. And I guess that, in the ways that have already been spoken about, those were sort of periods of, I guess, the most virulent exclusions, which have never really gone away, and we see them reenacted in all kinds of ways. And in Britain at the moment, actually, it's the Polish and Eastern Europeans who are now facing the same kinds of, violent street attacks that happened to South Asians, from the 1950s to the present. So my point is that, we're not alone in the kind of exclusions, the violences that we face, and these tend to be reenacted cyclically and then actually upon different peoples. So even if we escape, we gain measures of visibility and so on, success. We're still part of the same system that those things are then displaced onto other people. And so partly as, if we gain visibility and success, to never forget that actually that someone else is now the recipient of the exclusions that we might have faced. So while in England, I became involved with what's known as the Black Arts Movement. And so I became a Black British artist. And this was an alliance along post-colonial, anti-colonial lines, predominantly between South Asian and African Caribbean artists. And so the use of black as a political term to refer to a post-colonial perspective rather than a racial category. And of course that alliance was functional in different ways, successful in many ways, but also fragile and continuously under attack in ways of sort of, the typical divide and rule. There's a certain kind of slippage between in the use of the term black. So often using the term black, I didn't necessarily know whether it's being used politically or whether it's used racially. And if it's being used politically, then I'm included. If it's used racially, then I'm excluded, even though I'm from Africa. And so to address some of those exclusions, I was part of a collective of 5 artists. We formed a collective called Panchayat, which was an educational resource center. And mostly because, if you ask teachers in grade schools or even in universities and art schools, why don't you teach a broader curriculum or global perspectives in the curriculum? They would say, we don't have resources. We don't have the information. We don't know who these artists are. So that was one of the sort of impetus for this collective, that we produced a slide library, slides back in the day, a resource sort of catalog library. So we provided that information and then trained teachers in grade schools to expand their curriculum, and also trained artists to then work in schools. So then I became sort of South Asian alongside being Black British. And then I came to the US, and really the show that brought me here was called Interrogating Identities. And it was looking at the idea of blackness as it was being played out in Britain, Canada, and the US. And so it had artists from these three locations. And so I remained in the US, and of course I could no longer call myself black. It made no sense in terms of the American situation. I did try saying I'm Indian, but then someone did ask me which tribe. But I was also involved in Asian American networks and became very closely involved with Godzilla, the Asian American Artist Network here in New York. Although there again, there's certain kinds of questions around authenticity, whether I was sort of, and I've always faced this, whether I'm black enough, African enough, Asian enough, and with a name like Allan deSouza, whether I'm South Asian enough, and of course my accent too. So I remember at a conference, an Asian American conference, after speaking, the next speaker said, "Those of us who are more Asian." So I became South Asian again. One of the other sort of networks in which I function as an artist is within the field of contemporary African art. And so there's that double duty. I'm a contemporary African artist, but I'm also a South Asian artist. And I do insist on being able to function in these multiple arenas to expand the idea of what those categories could be. I do think it's important that we recognize that Africa is multinational, is multi-ethnic, multilingual. People like me can be African. And I think the same in South Asian context, that people with my accent, with my name, from histories, double migrations or triple migrations, also expand this notion of what South Asian can mean. My time card flashed up moments ago, so thank you.
Thank you, Allan. These wonderful works are upstairs for those of you who haven't had a chance to see them yet. Our next speaker will be Asha Ganpat. Asha is a multimedia visual artist born in Trinidad, lives and works in New Jersey, and she's also an educator as well as a curator and works with the Galleria Ferro, as well as other independent curatorial projects. Please welcome Asha.
Oh, I'm short. Okay. Maybe we'll do that. Hi. All right. My name is Asha Ganpat. Thank you, audience, for being here. It's wonderful to be here with my fellow panelists. Thank you, Jaishri Anu, Asia Society, the Brooklyn Museum of Art, and the Smithsonian Asian Pacific Center. All right, so again, my name is Asha Ganpat. I was born in Trinidad, and I had been under the suspicion that I was a fourth-generation Trinidadian, but this morning I had confirmed that I'm fifth, so new information. I am, my family were indentured servants from India that went to Trinidad, and the town where I was born, it was Trinidadian, like my Trinidadian family, the whole neighborhood. It all really was quite traditional in Hindu and Indian culture. They kept it with them, and it was passed on to me in some really wonderful ways through my childhood. In my artwork, I do everything but paint. No painting for me. But the topics that come through are ones that are so closely related to my experience with Trinidad. I often work with sexism. I often find the ability to create holy objects as a non-holy person in that kind of way, in a layman style. I work with ideas of corruption of power, racial identity, and passing. I do quite a bit of work involving passing. In 2016, I was at a residency at Alice Yard in Trinidad, where I made a series called Save Me Hanuman. And it was a series of works where I had Hanuman fighting all the bugs and insects in Trinidad that I am incredibly allergic to. So I ended up with a whole series of work where he did save me. That's how it worked out. It was successful. I'll show you a little bit of the other stuff before I speak to you about other topics. This is detail of a stranger's funeral pyre. It's from a video of Waterloo where they do cremations. This is a still of bubbles from the Pitch Lake in Trinidad. On the left is an altar called Altar of Petitions and Requests with some nails and some holes in that piece of wood for you. On the right is a letterpress drawing from a series called Decorous Violence. I was working with sanctioned violence, thinking about the violence that we're allowed to endure that's legal. And here you can see the weapon of that violence in lacework style, and that is a set of brass knuckles and a tooth with a little pool of blood. One day they will be doilies. It'll be great. This is a large chime called La Sonnette, made of nails. About 900 nails are here, and people can pull it. This is the last one I have for you. This is a series called Things, and these are the objects that I've identified as my family in Trinidad. The hairbrush, my father, he really likes to brush his hair. The mango, I had this crazy story from childhood that no one knows where it came from, but I thought one of my uncles had died from falling out of a coconut tree. But apparently it was totally something else. So, and then there's a machete. One of my uncles, I first met him when he came in from the bush and just put his machete down and just stared at me. And I'm like, hey, I'm your niece. We get along. Anyway, so I'll move on to other things. But it was a lot of fun to kind of break my family members down into these symbols, into these singular objects of memory. I also have been teaching for over a decade at Montclair State University in New Jersey. We have wonderful diverse representation in the students, international students. So often I'm able to talk about diaspora and work with a diaspora perspective for them. It's a unique, wonderful perspective that so many of the people in this room, I expect, are able to enjoy, I hope. And it's a mutable experience between insider and outsider. We're in both places, we're in neither place. We get to move between things depending our stage of that diaspora. This carries over into my approach to teaching. I encourage responsible visual communication with my students. I push to encourage them recognizing all the many cultures that they have, not just their ethnicities, all of the languages that they're able to speak, and I really push for the iconic languages. And then from that perspective of self-awareness, my students are able to discover great success in truly stating in their work, I guess, getting their work to have the conversations they're intending to have. And I think that comes from my interest in pulling them out of themselves and allowing them to have a similar experience of that diaspora where they're in but they're out. As a curator, I just want more of the work that I love to be out there, to be in shows. So I started to curate about 15 years ago. I co-founded a gallery called Red Saw Gallery in Newark. We were open for 3 years, but in 3 spaces, we had over 90 exhibitions. So we really, really promoted work. When I curate, I do return to explorations of gender. I started making sure all of the shows had equal numbers of male and female, and then I was kind of appalled by all female shows and all male shows, so I decided to try it. And I had one exhibition called Boys in Power, another one called Girls in Weakness, working with the assumptions, expectations, and limitations, just confronting all of their stereotypes. Coming on July 8th, at Gallery O'Farrow, there's an exhibition called On Belonging and the Void Between that I've curated. That is a selection of works about the nature of belonging and a look to the vacuous and vulnerable experience of being out of place. Without a sense of belonging, we are adrift in a sea of otherness. Of the ways we may untether from familiarity, the shift in becoming an outsider can shake the foundation of our very sense of self. That exhibition has artists from India, Iran, Argentina, Israel, and the US, and that's only 9 artists. I have some more to say, but I'm out of time. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you, Asha. And our last speaker this evening will be Jaret Vadera. Jaret is an interdisciplinary artist and cultural producer whose work explores how different social, technological, and cognitive processes shape and control the ways that we see the world around and within us. Please welcome Jaret.
Hello, everybody. So I guess I'm the end, and I'm following all these great presentations. So much of what you said really resonated with me in different ways, in different bits and pieces, and I hope we can unpack some of the stuff afterwards as well. But I, like Allan, was asked in some ways to talk about my experiences of South Asianness, or my experiences from another place as well, where I come from, and that's from Toronto, Canada. There's some Canadians out here. They're gonna be smirking and judging me. It's fine. It's fine. So I've spent a extended time in India, and I've been living in Brooklyn and Queens for about 20 years now. But this is where I started, in this community, in this apartment complex in a place called Thorncliffe, also just next door to Flemington Park, where I also grew up. And this area is, on the best of days, called an arrival city, and on the worst of days, called an immigrant ghetto. I just mentioned this in some ways because I want to also introduce the idea of class. As South Asians, we're always talking about how we're doing so well, everybody's doing so well. I mean, we weren't doing that well. And I think a lot of people aren't, we're unsuitable in many different ways. So, I was part of a generation of, multicultural generation of latchkey kids. We were all sort of code shifters, some who migrated when they were very young, and some who were born just after their parents had arrived. Most of the people had two names, spoke different languages, and practiced different religions. My father was Pratap at home, and he was Peter out in public. It is from this perspective I just wanted to start at the beginning, because from this perspective, I feel that it grows out and sort of infects everything that I do as an artist and as a cultural producer. It's complicated. People say it's complicated a lot. And it's complicated is normally something that people say when they're having a frustrating conversation about culture, negotiating something that they don't quite understand. But I think this is precisely the place we need to begin, especially in a conference like this, thinking about South Asianness. We need to resist the urge for quick and easy solutions. We love one-liners, we love clickbait, but this is actually to our detriment. We need to really to fight against this urge and resist it, especially when the devil is at our door. It's hard right now not to feel an imminent sense of danger in today's political climate, but binary politics is what they want. They want to numb us. They want to turn us into opposites. And binaries are a trap, and just reinscribe and recolonize our vision. How do we then protect our communities and build solidarity without essentializing ourselves in the practice, or in the process, rather? I often go back and forth about my feelings about art. I sometimes leave, but I often come back. And when I was in graduate school, and this is just a question that I've been wrestling with for a long time, if I'm a cultural producer, what culture do I produce from? What culture do I produce for? My father was from India, my mother's from the Philippines, I grew up in Toronto, I spent time here, I spent there. So where are you from? This sort of ominous, malignant question is one of the, maybe it's an easy question for some people, but it feels like one of the hardest questions to answer. Sometimes questions can actually be statements. And then the other question is, after what culture do I produce for, what happens if my references aren't found on any of their maps? But I continue to persist as an artist. I continue to come back, as many of us do, because ironically, and much to my surprise, I feel that making art and making things is one place I still feel free. I find conversations about race in America to be exhausting. I think I have been having the same conversations for at least 20 years. Whenever someone placatingly says that having a conversation is a good thing, I automatically cringe. I feel that we need to stop talking at each other. We need to start listening to each other. We need to stop debating, and we need to practice, decolonizing the ways that we think about language and ourselves in many different ways. We need to stop thinking in either ors and start thinking more in both ends. When we're debating, when we're talking, or when we're discussing, we we kind of need to stop saying things like, no, but. Somebody will say something, you say, no, but I'm more oppressed than you are, or no, but what about this part, or no, but. And we need to start saying, we need to take that clue from, what is it called, from when people are doing improvisation. It's that idea of yes and. So, yes and, yes and. So otherwise, we become dead in the water, and we are just stalling our own engines and fighting with each other instead of building together. But all this rhetorical, sort of conceptual stuff is all well and good. Internally, I may know who I am. I may cleverly define myself as a multi-positional culture of one, but that doesn't really mean shit at the airport. So again, I come back to this whole thing about how do we build solidarity within our communities that often define themselves in opposition to each other. We are us because they are them, right? I don't believe in unanimous revolutions where everyone is on the same page, or where we erase the real, historical, and contemporary issues of difference we face. I do, however, believe that the accumulation of many small actions and many collective actions can form a movement, especially if we can come together at key moments. And this is a quote by Grace Lee Boggs that I really love. I have an activist crush on her. She says that building community is to the collective as spiritual practice is to the individual. And I'll continue. And while our communities in many ways can be bound in many ways through trauma, art can also be a way to move forward. It can be a celebration of our complexity and our beautiful awkwardness, not just of a culture that we have passively inherited and performed, but as a culture that we are actively creating and building. Fatal Love was the first show that I was in as a South Asian American. I often move between contexts, and it's interesting to me to hear what context I'm in. And for me, it was kind of awkward. I mean, I kind of hate Bollywood. I can't really dance to Bhangra. My Punjabi and Hindi is sketchy at best. And these are some of the things I associated with, these authentic performances that I felt like I was asked to perform when I was younger. And people were sort of navigating identity politics and trying to get me to join. But I didn't, my process has been sort of both in and out, as many of us don't directly just quickly come to the term South Asian. I was always known as Filipino or Indian, but South Asian became something else. So it's this awkwardness. I felt awkward, but it's this awkward that's fundamental in many ways, and that I've embraced as one thing that binds many of us together. And as my vocabulary has grown, I have called myself authentically inauthentic, multi-positional, and then the word intersectional came around. Ambiguity became ambivalent, which became multivalent. And holding two or more positions at the same time is actually a strength and not a weakness. Ambivalence is not a halfway point towards authentic resolutions, but a contemporary state of being that many of us experience, to be embraced and celebrated. So I can keep on going, but I can also stop. So I mean, you had kind of asked to talk about like community and all that sort of stuff. So if I have 2 minutes, 1 minute, okay. So so let's try this. Let's figure it out. Okay. So I have also found myself in, wanting to also be the sort of change that I want to see in the world, is not finding art and making art to be enough. And so I've often found myself in the role of an independent curator. And one of the things that or as a writer, and many of the shows that I've been part of, I try to focus in some ways on artistic strategies or deeper structures at play in the work. And my shows become more about shape-shifting and code-switching, about semiotics and the poetics of translation and mistranslation. And I just wanted to say quickly that my South Asianness is also inextricably linked, interwoven with Black, Latino, Native American, feminist, queer, and trans movements. And it has to be, I think. Otherwise, I don't want to play at all. Right? Yeah. I am incensed by anti-blackness in our communities, and although we can talk for a long time about that, I will move on to the next and last slide. So I do need to say these things. So moving forward, it was sort of asked to talk about moving forward. I think we need to write more, we need to curate more, and we need to curate and think more with nuance and complexity. And looking to the future, I am really excited by the potential of organizing with short and long-term collectives, the potential of giving circles, of curatorial models that bring artists, writers, and filmmakers and activists and everybody together to imagine a way forward. I'm interested in projects that focus on process rather than product. And I think that we need to sort of address our differences and our privileges so that we can get our shit together and come together when it's time. And I wanted to just sort of share with you one of the things that I often think about when I'm feeling down or frustrated, and there have been many days in the last how many ever months, and there'll be many more. It's a quote by June Jordan when she says, "We are the ones that we have been waiting for." Thank you.
Wow, thank you guys so much. So we have a few minutes to have a discussion, and then we'd love to also open it up to the audience. I just have 2 questions that I want to put to the group. They may be lengthy in response, but I'll try to keep them brief. The first question, which has come up a couple of times already this evening, and which came up in our discussions preceding the panel, was, what are the conditions of our visibility? And do we control the terms of that visibility? What are the trade-offs? And in a society characterized by a rampant surveillance of public life in which skin tone, name, and mode of dress subject a body to increased scrutiny and observation, is visibility always a positive objective? With that, what potential might there be in a discourse of invisibility that might strategically reverse our assimilation as well as our erasure? Any thoughts?
In how many words?
Until they kick us off the stage with a hook. But can you talk about it a little from the context of the Black Art Movement, perhaps, and how visibility worked or didn't work for that group of artists?
I guess when I was being a little flippant when I was saying, I became one of these things, then to another, and I'm completely in line with Jaret that these are necessary alliances. And it's not that I'm being pushed from one to the other. These are ways of being in the world, and we can't do it alone. But one of the things that I would have come to in a sort of longer talk is to come back to art practice and its role within that sort of alliance making, and the image that I showed of the Taj Casino in some ways produces an immediate reading of a certain kind of visibility. So it's read as South Asian or Indian, whatever that is. And my particular academic interest is the invisibility of the rest of the world within European modernism. And of course, we know that European modernism could not, I wouldn't say achieved, it couldn't have happened without its colonies. And yet those colonies are not visible as practitioners and as contemporary cultures within European modernism. So, we might talk about invisibility as artists, but the larger invisibility are the terms in which our practices function. I could keep going on that.
No. What do you think, Asha?
I deal with this in a couple strange ways. One strange thing that happened about 4 months ago, I was told that I wasn't a woman of color with a capital C, but I still have to get searched every time I go through the airport. I mean, how many times can you be strip searched before they decide that you're not a problem? But I mean, it's the difference between my documents and what people see when they decide, and I think you decide to just be where you want to be and just assert yourself there and where you feel that you belong, what is true to you. And it was really hard to be told that I'm not who I am in that way. So yeah, I mean, between the invisibility and the visibility, or even just being misunderstood or mistaken in that way. So maybe the invisibility does lend itself to being mistaken too, and then placed somewhere else.
Well, one thing I hear in this vein that I wonder if you can speak to as a panel is there seems to be a point in the life of an artist of color when they don't want to be referred to as an artist of color anymore, and they say, well, can I just be an artist? And that, in a way, is because you've reached a certain level of visibility, you want to make something else invisible. And I'm kind of curious about that. What are these external pressures that might prompt someone to feel that necessity?
Is this on?
I think so.
Racism?
Might be in the way.
It came through.
Okay, that came through?
Yeah.
Okay. Amiro, Eurocentricism. The idea that you're both, when you just talk about who you are in the complexity of what that is, and it's marked as other, it immediately becomes legible within another sort of narrative that is actually a form of violence. And so saying that you're a South Asian artist, or saying that you're whatever artist, and by putting something or a hyphen in front of it, is, I mean, of course, we're all, like, we're South Asian artists. That's what we come from that. That's where we are. That's our history. That's our culture. But when you say that on a CV, then I don't want to center a conversation about people who are not invested, but many people in the larger world in New York are not invested in the nuance and complexity of what our experience and subjectivity means. So they put you in this like terrible box. You're like gonna, you're gonna paint blue gods, or you're gonna do this, or they ask you to perform in all these ways where they want you to be a cultural informant. At one time I went in graduate school. David, you might remember this at one point. So there was, so I was getting tired of hearing people like ask me where culture was in my work and trying to figure out what that looked like to them. So I put this poster, this like the tourist poster that says, the Incredible India poster. I put that on my wall, and it was just, I was like, ha ha ha, these guys are assholes. And but it actually totally backfired, because everybody came into the studio and they were like, oh my God, I love yoga. Have you gone to the like Indian restaurant down here? I just love it. Da, 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 da. And so I think like there's this thing between like, visibility and invisibility, legibility and like hyper legibility, but in the wrong story. That is why people sometimes choose to shapeshift in this way, just to like navigate.
I was going to say that one convention I've noticed in the art world that I have not noticed as much in the literary world is the convention of the object label always identifying the national origin of the artist. And I think for some of us who are, thank you for your chart, the naturalized citizens among us, no matter how many years I've lived here, my chart will always say India. And will also always have my age, which at one point meant something than what it means now, when you'd figure out who's the youngest in the exhibition, who's the oldest in the exhibition. I've been on both sides of that. And I think that that's really interesting, because I think that one thing that the art world, I think American, the American culture, racism, especially the art market, they're going to operate within certain paradigms, but within it, I think the idea of the nation and how we represent the nation sometimes. So I think sometimes for some of us who look like us, and our object label says England, our object label says America, says Canada, people are like, but wait, are you Canadian? Or, oh, why? So I think that is really interesting, and I'm wondering if there's a conversation with the art, within the art world, because I haven't always noticed that in other art forms as much, in terms of dance, theater, and writing, that one of the first things identified is the place that you were born. And there's always racial assumptions with nation.
And that would be my next question. Oh. Naeem, do you have anything to add before I move on?
Sure. This is on. I wanted to add, kind of to both your questions. The word diaspora is in here, as well as distant, but we haven't talked so much about what happens when cultural workers also, I wouldn't say go back, but spend time in the place that they're supposed to have a link to. And I think that's another way of disappearing from certain contexts. For example, even when I was looking at that chart, in the last 10, 15 years, there are a number of practitioners who have lived either in the United States, Canada, or Europe, and then at a certain point moved back to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, etc. And that's also related to economic flows and possibilities. And that can then make them very visible over there and become invisible here. But the visibility there is also very complicated because they can face, well, who are you and what's your stake in here? Are you a visiting artist? And the questions they'll get will be different from, let's say, a non-Asian background person. That's one thing. The other thing is, this always comes up about identifying, even label conventions are changing, right? At a certain time it was origin, then it became birthplace. Sometimes artists can choose not to have it at all. And it's also related to where they are in their arc, when they even have the clout to say, I don't want that in there. But I think one of the things that does happen is that no matter how many shows are happening, the number of artists of a certain origin, whether it's national or anything else, stays relatively constant, unless there's a sudden push for some reason. So I think one of the anxieties that will circulate is whether you are part of the checkbox. And at the beginning, it'll be, don't care if we're part of the checkbox, we're going to do our work anyway. But after a certain number of years, the checkbox will become a quite acute anxiety. And at that point, there'll be a desire to sort of remove identifiers so that you can say to yourself above everything else that the work is being selected for the work, not because this show needed at least one Nepalese artist. And in the South Asian context, for example, I mean, there's a triangle of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and then there's a larger arc. And a lot of those countries can very legitimately say to any of us that your countries are way more overrepresented in any of these shows. And that's also part of this very complex situation. And then the arrival of things like the Kochi Biennale, or the Kathmandu Triennale, all being there, and which are becoming now factors within the circulation of work, is also, I think, changing the picture. So some of the conversations we're having are also a Venn diagram between where we are now and where we were 20 years ago. And I think things are shifting, and we're in the middle of that conversation.
Thank you. So the other question that I wanted to put to the panel has to do with the frictions between internal and external conceptions of self, which I think follows on some of what we've been talking about. Some of these that we experience include being imagined as both foreigners and not actually here. We're frequently excluded from the public discourse of Asianness. For those of us who are born in the United States or came here as young children, these frictions may be so familiar that we're conditioned to ignore them and to expect them. For those who were born in South Asia and emigrated as older children or adults, these frictions, these pre-existing frictions of class, caste, religion, gender, language, could be exacerbated by new frictions that come with moving from a majority to a minority status. How, by addressing our own diverse communities' own internal frictions, might we move forward more seamlessly as a group? I don't know if this is a question we can answer right now or a question we could all be asking ourselves all weekend.
I think there's no one answer, but I think it's like you continue to ask these questions and try to address these problems that are in the room, and not just think about it in a defensive way or in like a problem to be solved, but to think about how to grow alliances and to build moving forward. Does that make sense?
I like to exploit it.
Exploit
I try to see how it can be useful to me, what I can use, and it just, I try to turn it into anything that becomes functional and productive, but definitely exploitation.
So you get the energy from the friction and then you can put it into the work.
Yeah, using the friction against itself in the presentation, in the exhibition, and when I'm curating, or just take it.
I'm still thinking about your first questions. And thinking about, why would artists becoming successful then drop this sort of moniker of South Asian or a hyphenated term? And so I do think there is a larger sort of question of art is already positioned as being being for the most part universalist. And so the idea that, whatever you make then speaks to everyone. And I think that if that's a kind of overriding assumption, then that's also the aspiration for artists, that your work then speaks to everyone. And if you call yourself a certain kind of artist, then the presumption is that your work only speaks to that particular group of people. And to become a successful artist, you're supposed to become more universalist. So I think it's more that we have to bring those ideas into question before we can even, so the idea of a universalist artist, for example, like I'm writing about Rothko, and first of all, it's like, why should someone like me be writing about Rothko? But thinking about Rothko and his interest in Assyrian art and Sumerian art and Babylonian art, and of course, if you think of Assyria, Babylonia, and Sumer, we're thinking of Iran, Iraq, Syria. And so how do we look at Rothko now in the present and have all those things erased? I mean, those histories erased. And is that erasure part of the steps towards becoming universalist? So becoming universalized means an erasure of every other culture that's named.
Is there an implication in the idea of the universal artist that there is a particular audience? Or what is the expectation of a universal audience?
Yeah, that the work speaks to everyone, that there are no formal barriers, there are no language barriers. That
How does that function?
Is bland.
Does it function?
Bland
Really
and that's divorced from location, it's divorced from context. It's abstracted from any specificity.
Then one could choose to make art where you have an intentional group of people that will not understand what you're doing. And that could be, you could do that, that's the exploiting thing. I mean, I don't know if we need to make art as just for everyone to be able to understand automatically.
No, even as viewers, I mean, we're trained as viewers to learn to appreciate certain kinds of work and value certain kinds of work over others. So, we're trained to look. Otherwise, we're standing on works of art. Why do we think of that as a table and not a sculpture? There is a training in looking. And so we're trained away from certain things.
Are we trained as artists to expect a certain audience, a specific audience? I think we're told we're expecting a universal audience, but I wonder if there's actually a more specific audience that we, if we set out to be universal, are actually trying to cultivate. And I think it might be helpful to name that audience.
I'm still thinking about friction, so...
It might be a place of friction.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, that idea of training, we being trained as viewers, means that artists, we shouldn't expect ready-made audiences. We're producing audiences alongside producing the artworks. The two go together.
Can I go back to something you said earlier?
Please.
It's all related. You said as a certain space happens, then people start removing the hyphenated whatever, right? I don't actually think that's true. I mean, besides the fact that you often from names or from the works, there are all sorts of signifiers anyway. But also I think we're at a particular time right now in the United States where the background of the artist or the curator or the institution is right at the foreground of the conversation. And okay, I was just writing down these names as listening to you, just the whole debate between, Dana Schutz, Hannah Black, Coco Fusco, now Zadie Smith's new piece, the brand new controversy about Jimmy Durham's Cherokee heritage, and then the debate about Sam Durant's sculpture. Those are just in the last 3-4 weeks. And yes, it might be temporary, but I feel that the conversation of the artist's specific situations, including every white artist who's working on whichever topic they might be working on, is actually very foregrounded in the United States. And in certain European contexts, it might actually be seen as strange and overthinking. And you'll often hear this from European curators or artists that, they might even say to me, because to their perspective, I'm American. They'll say, you Americans think about race too much. And I'm not sure if that's true either. There are ways that Europe talks about it that is different here. And these terms also don't mean anything, as everything is collapsing into each other. But I think the situation of the artist as it bleeds into the work, even if they're an abstract painter, is in the center of the conversation. So I don't feel we're going away from it. And I feel, because it's a convening also, I think there's conversations here in the material, in the ways we're talking about each other, which I think have a little bit of nostalgia of conversations that were happening 15 years ago. And that's not the conversation happening right now. And actually, I'm really curious to talk to an 18, 19, 20-year-old who's in college doing a BFA or whatever. And they might find all of this quite alien and or alienating. And I think their conversations, I think there's a generational fissure and a constraint in how we're talking about things.
I think you may be right about that. I also think, based on my own experience, I didn't realize that I would be a South Asian curator right away. Because it wasn't my training, it wasn't my background, it wasn't my experience, and it wasn't where I was born. But once I reached a certain point and I wanted to enter certain institutions, my South Asianness was read before my resume. And the decision was made as to whether I was a good fit or not a good fit on that basis. And it honestly took me by surprise. So while I agree with you that young people may not think this way, I also think sometimes it's because they don't know yet. I wonder, do we have time to take any questions, or do you need us to wrap it up? 2? Okay, 2 questions. Who's a brave soul and wants to ask a question? Stand up so I can see you, because it's super bright. Or make a statement. We'll let that stand as long as it's not really long. Aruna. Hi.
Oh, there's a mic. Hi. I wanted to sort of ask about 2 different things smushed together. But one was Jaret's very important point, and I think other people have raised it as well, that there are the danger of being a model minority in the States is the erasure of actual variations in class backgrounds within the community, and that there is a kind of there are people who are speaking and people who aren't given platforms or don't have the opportunity to speak. But at the same time, as we're talking about structures and the kind of structures that would support the kinds of visibilities, there's a very basic one of money, and that in the community, among South Asians, there is, in fact, a great deal of wealth, and that we don't seem to have a pipeline to that wealth to create the kinds of exhibition opportunities or whatever it is, especially within mainstream institutions, that frankly has always surprised me. And I know that none of you are necessarily working, some of you may be working with those very basic questions of how you fund an exhibition and things like that. But does anyone have any thoughts about why that particular connection seems not to have been made? Like, why aren't we draining all of this money from our rich aunties and uncles to get these to make these opportunities happen? And why are those structures not in place, or where do they need to be developed? That's my question.
Well, I'll have a few thoughts, but I want to kick it over to everybody else.
This is not an answer, but I also don't agree that there's tremendous concentrated wealth in the community. There's tremendous class diversity in the community, so there's a tremendous amount of poverty in large sections of the community as well. So we shouldn't, but the way you describe it kind of makes that disappear.
This is statistical. I mean, the South Asian Americans are one of the wealthiest, which is not to say that every South Asian is wealthy, but as a demographic
in the U.S., that's just statistical. Nigerians and South Asians as immigrant groups are the 2 wealthiest immigrant groups in this country, right? And so, which is precisely not to try and erase the fact that as with every group in America, that wealth is not evenly distributed, right? There's, there's 1%ism in South Asian communities as with every other community. But there is wealth in the community, and that we're not, it feels like that wealth isn't directed towards contemporary art. And so the question is, why isn't it directed towards contemporary art? That's my question.
I can try to answer that, at least from my experience in a pretty traditional South Asian community that's really based in a company town of IBM. And what I've witnessed, and I think one thing is that there is quite a bit of philanthropy, but it tends to go back home, often to certain kinds of causes that may not necessarily mesh with the kinds of issues that many artists are dealing with. And then if there is arts, it tends to be more classical arts. The one thing that I did notice that was very interesting before my kind of departure from the art market was after the market crashed in New York, it was still pretty big, in Mumbai, and that a lot of the young people in finance in India actually were becoming big collectors and collecting South Asian art from within South Asia, also, within Asia, and definitely diasporic art. So I'm not really sure, what the connection is. I also know that, from my own experience when I was at Columbia, there was a lot of fundraising for the chair in the India chair of the history department, and it became. There was a huge lawsuit about this 20 years ago. Some people in this room know exactly what I'm referring to. It became very contentious when the historian, who was very qualified, happened to be Muslim, and where the funding went for that. And I think that some of the worst I've just personally witnessed. Some of the most Islamophobic, most casteist, most patriarchal, like some of the ugliest behaviors that our community can be part of, unfortunately, within some of that 1% that does have some financing capital here. And so I know that there are many initiatives. There's like South Asian philanthropy projects. There's many people doing this kind of work that is, sometimes the work of education, the work of, involvement, involving people in the grassroots into building community organizations and then becoming funders of it. So I think there is a new generation of funders that are slowly developing, and some of them are here in this room. But I know that that's a definite tension that I think I've noticed in the United States, at least among Indian American, communities that have been here for about 40 years. So, sorry.
I just want to add that while I concur with much of what's been said, I do think it is changing. And I think that a big part of what's been underpinning that lack of investment is that for many first-generation immigrants of my parents' generation, people who came in the 60s and the 70s, they gave up a lot of what they believed themselves to be and be about by coming here. And the trade-off was that they would do well financially, but that their hearts were sort of always left back overseas. And there was a nostalgia. And then their choices in terms of the culture that they wanted to invest in were fed by that nostalgia. And the reason I think it's changing is because now that we're well into a second and third generation of this community, the people who don't have that same relationship to the culture through nostalgia, and who have more of a sense of contemporary cosmopolitan cultural outlook, do find some resonance in the work that the artists today are making, and they are starting to invest. But the other side of it is that we need to still educate our community and actually people across the board, because this country has little to no critical thinking education, little to no visual cultural education. They're not equipped to be knowledgeable consumers of contemporary art. So it falls to us, and I think particularly those of us who are curators and educators and writers, it really falls to us to help people understand what the values of the art that we make are and why it's of value for them to support it. Do we have one last question? I think they're bringing you a mic.
I have a question about visibility, not just necessarily as an artist, but maybe someone working in the art world and working in an environment where you are a minority and you came from a culture that didn't necessarily teach you that visibility is a good thing, but you're trying to like navigate between being visible, being able to respect your heritage and having that be a part of your everyday life, and dealing with an environment that maybe it's not the most, your visibility isn't necessarily welcome unless you assimilate, and how one can sort of navigate that.
So one of the things that I've often struggled with is how do I, as an American-born and raised person, and I think different people will have different experiences with this, but from my perspective, how do I negotiate what seems to be a fundamental conflict between feminism and modesty? And as someone who was raised in a South Asian family, while I think of myself as being quite assimilated and also quite a feminist, I think that one of the things I have retained is I do have a certain attachment to some idea of modesty. And I think that modesty can be thought of in some ways as a form of invisibility that is by choice, if it is by choice, right? The question is always, is this coerced or is it by choice? But if it's by choice, it can be a position of power. Even the burqa can be a position of power if it is by choice.
In representing oneself, with the exhibition that's opening on July 8th, I originally wanted it to be an exhibition of immigrants and people who immigrated themselves, that made that choice in their lives. And when I started to speak with people about it, no one wanted to do it. The idea did come out after January of this year. So I actually had a lot of people that really dug into their invisibility on that level. So fear could very well be a good reason why people are really embracing some invisibility right now too.
I was going to say that I think that even within our cultures and even in maybe family cultures, I don't want to say cultures mutable category, that I think that there's a time in which many of us when we're young, we have to do a lot of searching, but there's always, I think, when we dig, there's always an ancestor, an uncle, an aunt, a family friend, and then even within our history, within literature, within history, there's just so many great models. And I think that's also the idea of having a constellation of influences. That's the really important idea that queer communities have developed, like of chosen family. And I think that that's important if that's what you're seeking. And maybe it isn't in your immediate environment, but it can be curated. And maybe the people are alive, maybe they're not, maybe they're connected to you, and through family, maybe they're not. But I think it can give any of us that kind of strength to find ourselves, because I think sometimes the constellation of the people that we see ourselves in communication with help us figure out who we are.
So before we wrap, Jaishri, I see you coming down the stairs. Do you have anything to add to our discussion? Or just that it's time to go party? Yes, ma'am. So we are out of time. We welcome you to join us for a reception in the galleries, and then we will be following up with another party. We have a curators party, so on behalf of the curators in the room, I want to invite you all to join us at Icon Gallery on Great Jones Street later this evening for the second half of our party, and we're going to have a really great time. Thank you so much for being here. And don't eat. Yeah. Of course we will.